I'm Melissa Case from Hat to Hem. I'm running behind today because I accidentally saved over my script at some point over the last month. So today we're just gonna jump right in. Last fall, my friend Becca commissioned an Elizabethan-inspired hat to match her new garb for the Renaissance Fair. I decided to use Lynn McMaster's Elizabethan Bonnet pattern, and I'll post a link in my description below. To make this hat, I used fabric from her gown, both the main fabric and the accent fabric. I used Buckram and flannel to make the frame, as well as millinery wire, wire cutters, a seam gauge, a pencil, and bias tape. Of course, I needed scissors, a rotary blade, and a clear ruler as well. I also had a few options for trimming the hat, though I didn't use all of them. Oh, and I also used glue. As always, the very first thing I needed to do was trace my pattern onto a piece of scrap paper and transfer all the markings. You'll notice I'm only tracing half of that pattern. I know this pattern is symmetrical, so only tracing half will save me time now and later when I cut out my fabric. Plus, drawing perfect circles is hard, even when you're tracing them. This will at least guarantee that, if nothing else, my circle is symmetrical. I usually try to keep my original pattern intact. This is so I don't lose any of the pieces, which definitely sounds like something I would do. As a side note, you may notice that some of the video clips are on the blurry side. I had been experimenting with a different camera angle and it messed up my video orientation. It was either have the video be a little blurry or have it in portrait mode where everything looked tiny. So if you're ever watching one of my videos and all of a sudden the image is a little blurry, you now know the reason. Once my pattern is traced, I always write the pattern number, if any, what the pattern is supposed to be, the piece number, if any, cutting instructions, and the size. You never realize how important that information is until you either have two nearly identical pattern pieces or you find a pattern piece under your cutting table 3 months after you finish the project. Ask me how I know. Now that that's out of the way, it's time to work with the pretty fabric. I did my best to have the center of the crown line up with the center of one of the motifs because I'm annoying like that. In addition to the fashion fabric, I also cut out the flannel and the lining. Next, I traced out the brim onto the buckram. I'm not gonna lie, I love tracing patterns onto buckram because it's just so much easier than fabric. You can use a pencil without fear, and if you have any finicky pattern markings, you can just pop the pattern under the buckram and trace it because you can see right through it. It just makes life so much easier. I will note that I am using my paper/craft scissors to cut out the buckram, not the good fabric scissors. For those who don't sew, we always make sure that we use our fabric scissors only on fabric. This way they stay nice and sharp. Trying to cut fabric with blunt scissors, or worse, scissors with a little nick in them, is awful and I would not recommend it. Anyway, I cut out a piece of the fashion fabric, I cut out a second piece of the fashion fabric to serve as the lining, and I cut 2 pieces of flannel. Now that everything is cut out, it's time to turn this into a hat. To get the right length of wire, I marked my starting point on the buckram, and then I walked the wire around the edge of the brim, overlapping the wire at least an inch at the end. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but I always straighten out my wire before I work with it. This is called springing the wire, and I work section by section until the whole length is straight. I know, it curves, and it's going around a curve. But I want the buckram to decide how the wire curves, not the other way around. I want the buckram and the wire to work together to keep the brim in shape. Once the wire decides to play nicely, I attach the wire to the buckram by machine using a wide zigzag stitch. Now you can absolutely do this by hand if that brings you joy. I just prefer to use my machine because it's faster and no one will see these stitches. Once the wire is attached, I cover the edge with bias tape or crinoline tape if that's what I have on hand. I used basic Elmer's glue for this, but I've heard that fabric tack works wonderfully. The tape smooths out the edges and keeps everything nice and even, which is extra nice because those buckram edges can be really rough. Now the brim gets set aside to dry and I get to direct my attention to the crown. This hat is unique to the others that I've made because the crown is soft instead of wired. The first thing I did was transfer the pattern markings to the lining. I poked a hole in every dot of my pattern, then I used my disappearing ink pen to mark each dot. I probably could have used a pencil, but this was just more satisfying. I layered my lining, fashion fabric, and flannel and stitched around the edge, leaving a small opening. Once I pressed my stitches, I turned the whole thing inside out, pressed it again, and stitched the opening closed by hand. Using a long length of thread, I ran a long running stitch around the edge of the crown using the dots as a guide. Back to the brim! I ran a stay stitch around what will be the opening of the hat brim. I snipped into my seam allowance now, but honestly I could have waited until later. Oh well. I took a piece of flannel and I clipped it to the brim, keeping the flannel nice and taut. I secured the flannel by stitching right on top of the stay stitching I made earlier. I then stitched the edge down close to the wired edge. I flipped the whole thing over and repeated the process with the second piece of flannel and then again with the fashion fabric. Then I got to move on to one of my least favorite tasks, making bias tape. And I made it too wide right off the bat. Great. Once I gave the fashion fabric and flannel a trim, I clipped the new bias strip all around the edge of the hat, overlapping the ends. I machine stitched the bias down, but I made the mistake of starting on top of the overlapped bit. Ugh, I hate this part. Whew, okay, I'm calm. After breaking out the seam ripper, I was able to get the bias stitched on properly. I flipped the bias binding over the brim and tucked the raw edge under. The binding was then hand stitched in place using a slip stitch. You'll notice I'm not using a thimble. As many of you know, I am self-taught, but one of the things I never taught myself was how to properly use a thimble. If anyone has a good how to use a thimble video, send it to me because I have yet to find a comfortable way to wear one. And done. As annoying as it is to make, I'll admit, the binding looks pretty nice. Now it's time to cut out the opening because otherwise this would look absolutely ridiculous. By the way, this is the correct time to snip into the seam allowance. But don't let me tell you what to do. If snipping it early makes you happy, go for it. Now the instructions called for another step with bias tape, but I thought it was a bit confusing, so yeah, I'm not doing that yet. Now to bring it all together. Between the fabric, the flannel, and the 2 rows of stitching, the hat just popped right into the correct shape, and I kinda love it. With a clear idea of what's going on, I attached the bias tape to the brim's opening. Sometimes you need to step away from part of a project so that you can understand how it fits into the big picture. Amazingly, I didn't get footage of actually sewing the crown to the brim. I tacked the gathers of the crown to the tabs I pressed up from the opening of the brim, and I wish I could show you it, but I can't. Sorry. Time for trim, which means more bias strips. Yay. I folded the edges of the strip under and quickly stitched them together by hand. I then box pleated the strip and secured it right down the middle using my sewing machine. I folded and secured the top and bottom of each pleat to make a pulled box pleat. For a little fun, I put a bead where I secured each pleat. I added the trim to the hat by stitching the back of the trim to the crown. just a little short. I made up one more pleat and tacked it over the gap. Remember that bias tape from earlier? To hide the brim tags and keep everything neat, I flipped the tape up and tacked it to the lining. And with that, the hat is done! One last thing though. Every time I make a hat, I like to include a matching hat pin. And here's Becca with the finished hat. Doesn't she look lovely? Her color choices were so good, and I just really love how this whole look came together. Oh, before you go, I want to give a quick announcement. I am once again working on my website. If you go to hattohem.com, you'll be able to sign up to be notified when the website goes live. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like or comment, and I'll see you next time. Bye!